All right, everyone, welcome to today's video on the Minnesota W-4 equivalent. I am going to go ahead and share my screen here and show you guys how I find whenever I'm searching for the state W-4 equivalent, I just type in the name of the state and W-4. And usually the first result is from the state that I'm looking for and their W-4. This video, we're doing the Minnesota W-4 equivalent. And so that takes you to this page and it gives you the information on the form W-4, when to complete it, when to send copies to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and when to complete. Every time a business hires an employee or the employee starts a new job, or when they want to make any changes to their W-4 because of a change in their personal or financial situation, you will fill out a new W-4 if you want to adjust the amount of taxes being withheld from your paycheck. If an employee does not complete a W-4 for Minnesota when they apply or when they're hired at a new job, the default is to use single and zero for their withholding allowances. And employers do not need to verify the number of allowances that the employee claims, and you should honor the federal W-4 and the W-4MN unless Minnesota Department of Revenue instructs you differently, which kind of seems to conflict when to send copies to Minnesota Department of Revenue. So anytime an employee claims more than 10 withholding allowances, the Minnesota W-4 needs to be sent to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. Whenever an employee claims to be exempt from Minnesota withholding, and you reasonably expect wages to exceed $200 per week, but do not send a form W-4MN from Michigan and North Dakota residents if they have provided a form MWR, reciprocity exemption affidavit of residency, because that gets into reciprocity, which is not part of this video today. And if you believe that your employees are not entitled to the number of allowances claimed, then you would also send that to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And the reason that I say that it kind of conflicts with what was said earlier on this website, where you don't need to verify the number of allowances claimed, you honor the form, but you still send it to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and they will instruct you if you are going to accept the W-4MN, or they will tell you what their withholdings really are, or if there are additional amounts. I haven't seen very many of the letters. I think for Minnesota, I've only seen one, and it was a parent who was claiming exempt, and they routinely owed or had income taxes that they owed. When you claim exempt, you can there are certain qualifications that you have to meet, and the employer won't know, but they could find some of the withholding allowances to be suspicious. And there is a $50 penalty for each W-4MN form that is not sent to the Minnesota Department of Revenue when it's required to be sent. I'm not entirely sure how the compliance on that works. I just know that there will be times where Minnesota could come to an employer and say, hey, I want to see these W-4s. And, if you've got employees that are claiming more than 10 Minnesota withholding allowances, or they claimed exempt, and those forms should have been sent, there will be a penalty assessed. All right, so we're going to click on this link up here for the form W-4MN. We'll go ahead and start at the top of the form. The top part is pretty standard. It's your first name and middle initial, last name, permanent address, city, state, and zip code. And the reason that the Minnesota W-4 has specifically lists out that it needs your permanent address is because there are oftentimes a lot of college students that live various in temporary locations while they're at college, and their parents' address or another address could be where they permanently live. And there's also plenty of other examples of temporary addresses that I'm not going to get into. And then over here, and I really don't like that it's over here on the right-hand side of the form, is where you enter in your social security number. I don't like it because it kind of hides here. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see when people are filling out Minnesota W-4 is they forget to put the social security number on because it kind of hides. In this box here, there is the marital status. We've got single or married, but legally separated, or the spouse is a non-resident alien. And then you've got married or married, but withhold at a higher single rate. Some of the other forms include married, but withhold at a higher single rate with single, but Minnesota does not do that. And I am not entirely sure of the reason why. So then after you fill out the header, you move on to filling out section 1 or section 2. And this is where you will claim your allowances and exemptions. So in line A, you'll enter a 1 if no one else can claim you as a dependent. Line B, you'll enter line 1 if any of the following apply. You are single and have only one job. You are married and have only one job and your spouse does not work, or your wages from a second job or your spouse's wages are $1,500 or less. I usually will see people get into trouble here where, the instructions say to enter 1, but sometimes I'll see people put, if this applies, they'll enter 1. If this applies, they'll enter 1. So they would enter, I've seen people enter 2 here, but this line B is either going to be 0 or 1. Line C, you'll enter a 1 in the box if you are married, or you can choose to enter 0 if you're married and either have a working spouse, or if you have more than one job. You can also enter 0, which will help in avoiding having too little tax withheld. I'm going to get more into strategy on what different filing statuses and exemptions and allowances will do for you at tax time. But again, I'm not going to get too deep into it because everybody's personal situation varies. And this is not tax advice. This is just information on how to fill out a Minnesota W-4. On line D, you'll enter the number of dependents other than your spouse or yourself that you claim on your income tax return. So if you have 3 dependents on your tax return, you would fill out 3 here. If you don't have any dependents on your tax return, you'll fill out 0. And line E, you'll enter 1. If you'll use the filing status head of household, we'll get more into those instructions later. F is you'll add steps A through E, but if you plan to itemize deductions on your 2024 Minnesota income tax return, you may also want to complete the itemized deductions and additional income worksheet, which we'll get to later. So line 1 is where you'll enter step F from section 1 or step 10 from the itemized deduction worksheet. And line 2, you will enter if you want to have any additional Minnesota withholding deducted for each pay period. So if you enter $20 here, an extra $20 will be deducted each paycheck that you receive. Sometimes I see line 2 filled out a lot. If you're already filing single, zero, or married, but withhold at the single rate and zero exemptions and deductions, and the person still ends up owing on their Minnesota income tax return, this is not for federal income taxes. This is only for Minnesota. Section 2, you'll complete if you claim to be exempt from Minnesota income tax, and you have to see Section 2 instructions for qualifications. So if applicable, you'll check one box to indicate why you think you're exempt. A, you meet the requirements and claim exempt from both federal and Minnesota income tax withholding. B, even though I do not claim to be exempt from federal withholding, I claim to be exempt from Minnesota because I had no Minnesota income tax liability last year. I received a refund of all Minnesota income tax withheld, and I expect to have no Minnesota income tax this year. Or C, all of these apply. My spouse is a military service member assigned to a military location in Minnesota. My domicile legal residence is in another state. I am in Minnesota solely because of my spouse and my domicile. The state of my domicile is, and then you would fill this out. But again, in order to mark line C, all of these have to apply. D, I'm an American Indian that resides and works on a reservations for which I am enrolled, and there's instructions for that. And you have to enter the reservation name, and you have to you have to enter in your certificate of degree of Indian blood enrollment number. So all of that has to be true in order to mark box D. You're a member of the Minnesota National Guard or active duty U.S. military member and claim exempt from Minnesota withholding on military pay. If the person is applying for a position at a bakery or an office, this would not apply. This would only apply for Minnesota National Guard or active duty U.S. military member who is getting military pay. If it's not military pay, E will not apply. F, I receive a military pension or other military retirement as calculated under U.S. Code Title 10, Section 1401 through 1414, 1447 through 1455, and 12733. And I claim exempt from Minnesota withholding on this retirement pay. So again, if it's not a military pension or military retirement pay, checking box F will not apply. And now we get to the part where you certify under penalty of perjury, which is a $500 penalty for filing a false Minnesota W-4 that the information that you have already entered above is accurate and complete. And then there's an employer section, which I have only ever seen this part filled out if the form is required to be sent to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. If not, it is not normally filled out, but it does need to be held on to and retained as a part of the employment file. All right. So some of this we've covered on the website. You know, when must I complete a Minnesota W-4? When you begin employment, you change your filing status. You reasonably expect to change your filing status in the next calendar year. So say you plan to get married this year, you haven't been married yet. As soon as you reasonably expect to get married, you can change from single to married if you choose to. If at any point you discover you're not going to get married for whatever reason, you change it back. And I have seen, people change their filing status when they expect to get divorced, or, if you're pregnant, you can add the allowance that you expect to claim on your tax return. So you can change your filing status as soon as it's reasonable that your tax situation will change. You claim exempt from Minnesota withholding. So every single year if you claim exempt from Minnesota withholding, you have to file a new Minnesota W-4. If you don't, then your employer will default to single zero. A lot of times, employers don't know that there's a requirement every single calendar year to receive a new Minnesota W-4, or federal W-4 for that matter, when a person claims exempt, because normally when you fill out a W-4 or a Minnesota W-4, it's good until you change it. The exception is when somebody claims to be exempt, those expire on December 31st, always. And if you have not had sufficient Minnesota income tax withheld from your wages, the state of Minnesota can assess penalties and interest when you file your income tax return. And your employer may be required to submit a copy of your form W-4 to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and you may also be subject to a $500 penalty if you provide a false Minnesota W-4. You must enter your Social Security on the W-4 for it to be valid. What if I have completed a federal W-4? If you've completed a federal W-4, you must also complete a form W-4MN to determine your withholding allowances. So every time you change your federal W-4, you have to change your Minnesota W-4. A lot of times, people will just change one and not the other, but changing one requires you change the other. So, on the flip side, you can't just change your Minnesota W-4 without changing your federal W-4. What if I'm exempt from Minnesota withholding? If you claim to be exempt from Minnesota withholding, complete only section 2 of form W-4MN and sign and date the form to validate it. If you complete section 2, you must complete a new form W-4 by February 15th on each following year in which you will claim exemption from Minnesota withholding. You cannot claim exempt from withholding if all of these apply. Another person can claim you as a dependent on their federal tax return. Your annual income exceeds $1,100, or your annual income includes more than $350 of unearned income, which unearned income is income you don't work to earn. So it could be a dividend or interest income. So what if I'm a non-resident alien for U.S. income taxes? If you are a non-resident alien, you are not allowed to claim exempt from withholding. You will check the single box for marital status regardless of your actual marital status. And you may enter one person allowance on step A of section 1. So you'll enter 0 on steps B, C, and E of section 1. If you're a resident of Canada, Mexico, South Korea, or India, and are allowed to claim dependents, you can enter the number of dependents in step D. So section 1, Minnesota allowances worksheet. You'll complete section 1 to find your allowances for Minnesota withholding. For regular wages, withholding must be based on allowances you claim and may not be a flat amount or a percentage of wages. If you expect to owe more income tax for the year than will be withheld, you can claim fewer allowances or request additional Minnesota withholding from your wages. Enter the amount of additional Minnesota income tax you want withheld on line 2 of section 1. Non-wage income. Consider making estimated payments if you have a large amount of non-wage income. Non-wage income other than tax-exempt income includes interest dividends, net rental income, unemployment compensation, gambling winnings, prize and awards hobby income, capital gains, royalties, and partnership income. So if you're two earners or if you have multiple jobs, you want to figure out the total number of allowances you're entitled to claim on all jobs using the worksheets from only one form, Minnesota W-4. Usually, your withholding will be more accurate when all allowances are claimed on the form Minnesota W-4MN for the highest paying job, and 0 allowances are claimed on the others. You may claim head of household as your filing status if you are unmarried and pay more than 50% of the cost of keeping up a home for yourself and your dependents. Enter 1 on step E if you may claim head of household as your filing status on your return. So what if you itemize your deductions on your Minnesota return or you have other non-wage income? That's when you're going to use the itemized deduction and additional income worksheet to find your Minnesota withholding allowances. Complete section 1 on page 1, then follow the steps on the worksheet to complete on the next page to find your additional allowances. So here is where you will enter numbers, and for whatever reason, this part is not fillable like the rest of the form. So sometimes you'll have, if you're going to do it digitally, you'll have to open it in a PDF software that allows you to type text in non-fillable sections or print it out and write on it like we used to before computers were so prevalent. So 1, enter an estimate of your 2024 Minnesota itemized deductions. You may have to reduce your itemized deductions if your income is over $232,500 or $116,250 for married filing separately. And you'll enter one of the following based on your filing status: $29,150 if married filing joint, $21,900 if filing head of household, $14,575 if single or married filing separately. Subtract step 2 from step 1. If 0 or less, enter 0. You cannot have a negative number. On line 3, line 4, enter an estimate of your 2024 additional standard deduction from page 11 of the Form M1 instructions. Form M1 is the income tax instructions, and that is not something that will be covered in this video. Then line 5, add steps 3 and 4. Step 6, enter the estimate of your 2024 taxable non-wage income. So don't enter earnings that will appear on a W-2. This is where you will enter the non-wage that was described earlier. 7, subtract step 6 from step 5. If 0, enter 0. If less than 0, enter the amount in parentheses. So on step 7, you can have a negative number. On Step 8, divide the amount in step 7 by $5,050. If a negative amount, enter in parentheses. Do not use fractions. So this will be a whole dollar amount. Line 9, enter the amount from step F of section 1 on page 1. And finally, you'll add step 8 and 9 and enter the total here. If 0 or less, enter 0. So again, here you cannot have a negative number. And then you'll enter this number on line 1 of page 1. I know this is super confusing for a lot of people. That's why I go over reading these instructions and trying to help people figure out what they want to claim. Section 2 is for the Minnesota exemption. So a lot of this we've already talked about above. So I'm not going to go over all of this again, but the big point I want to make is if you fill out section 1, you cannot fill out section 2. If you fill out anything in section 2, you cannot fill out anything in section 1. If an employer receives a Minnesota W-4 that has something in both section 1 and section 2 filled out, it is not valid, and they must return it to the employee who filled it out and let them know. If you fill it out online, it will not let you, or will it? It will now. It didn't used to. It didn't let you use to put anything in section 1 and fill something out for section 2. Apparently they changed that restriction, which it was really nice when it didn't let you fill out. But now apparently it does. And so you just have to be super careful when you're filling it out so that you don't accidentally submit an invalid Minnesota W-4. The new part of this exemption section is there are some restrictions on the Minnesota Chippewa tribe that can exclude income regardless of which Minnesota Chippewa tribe reservation you live and work on. And it affects members of Mille Lacs, Net Lake, Fond du Lac, Leech Lake, White Earth, and Grand Portage. So there are special rules for members of those American Indian tribe that aren't the same for everybody. And I am not totally familiar with those rules. And we've already talked about all of those. We've already talked about all of that. And now here are the Minnesota employer instructions. Previously, everything was that was listed before was the employee instructions. And so this is the part where the state of Minnesota tells you that if there's a lock-in letter, which is the IRS letter 2800C, tells you when the IRS believes your employee may have filed an incorrect federal W-4. And if you receive this letter, you must provide the Minnesota Department of Revenue with a copy of the employee's form Minnesota W-4. And Minnesota Department of Revenue is the we here that will verify the number of allowances that the employee may claim on for Minnesota purposes and continue to use the form W-4MN that you were using at the time that you receive IRS letter 2800C until Minnesota Department of Revenue notifies you of a change to the amount of allowances on the employee's Minnesota W-4. But if the employee has not completed a Minnesota W-4 you have to have them complete the form and submit that to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. So here is a really black and white area that if the employer receives an IRS letter 2800C, they have to get a Minnesota W-4 from the employee and send that into the Minnesota Department of Revenue. If they don't, there will be a $50 penalty assessed. When does an employee have to complete a W-4MN? It's the same as completing a federal W-4. It is no later than when they begin employment or when their personal or financial situation changes. Now, the employers aren't going to know when a personal or financial situation changes for sure. However, if somebody comes to work and they're all excited about getting married or all excited about getting divorced, then the employer will reasonably be expected to know that the personal or financial situation changed. And, sometimes I've seen where people get promotions. Part of their packet includes new federal or state W-4s, because that can change their financial situation. And that is another time where a business would be reasonably expected to know that their financial situation changed. But you can't make an employee fill out a new W-4 if you suspect a change has taken place. You keep using the Minnesota W-4 and federal W-4 until they provide you with new ones. And if they've not filled out a Minnesota withholding or Minnesota W-4, then the employer will use a federal W-4 from 2019 or prior years that's on file. You can use the allowances on the federal W-4. Otherwise, you withhold Minnesota tax as if the employee is single with zero withholding allowances, and which is the highest tax withheld possible without filling out the extra withholding. What if my employee claims to be exempt? If your employee claims to be exempt from Minnesota withholding, they fill out section 2. They provide you with a new Minnesota W-4 by February 15th of each year. If you're paying an employee for wages that are exempt from withholding, such as Medicaid waiver payments or wages to H-2A visa workers, do not send a form W-4MN to the Department of Revenue. However, you do need to submit copies of the Minnesota W-4 to the Department of Revenue if the employee claims more than 10 withholding allowances. And yes, we've covered this already, but it's really important. So I'm going to read it again. And the employee checked box A or B under section 2, and you reasonably expect the employee's wages to exceed $200 per week. You believe the employee is not entitled to the number of allowances claimed. You don't need to submit a form W-4MN to the Department of Revenue if the employee is asking to have additional Minnesota withholding deducted from their pay. And the Minnesota Department of Revenue may assess a $50 penalty for each W-4MN not filed with Minnesota Department of Revenue when required. And you'll mail them to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, mail station 6501, 600 North Robert Street, St. Paul, Minnesota, 55146, 6501. And it doesn't have a deadline to get them mailed in. But I always tell my employers to follow the same rules with Minnesota new hire reporting. You have 20 days. I would mail a W-4 that you get from an employee that meets the qualifications on when it's required to be submitted to the Minnesota Department of Revenue within 20 to 30 days at the most. And if you have an employee who resides in a state that has a reciprocity agreement with Minnesota, the employee will complete a form MWR, reciprocity exemption affidavit of residency, if both they are a resident of North Dakota or Michigan, and they do not want you to withhold Minnesota tax from their wages. And this is an exemption from withholding that does not need to be mailed into the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And again, the MWR expires December 31st every year and is required to be completed no later than February 28th of each year, or within 30 days after they begin working or change their permanent residence. What's an invalid Minnesota W-4? It's when there's an unauthorized change or addition to the form, including any change to the language clarifying the form is correct. The employee indicates in any way the form is false by the date they provide you with the form is incomplete or lacks necessary signatures. Both sections 1 and 2 are complete, or the employer information is incomplete. So I very rarely see the employer information filled out on the Minnesota W-4, but anytime the form has to be submitted to the state, it is required to be there. If it's not, it's incomplete and invalid. And anytime the state of Minnesota wants to see all your W-4s, you need to make sure that it's there. So, if you have an invalid form, you don't use it to calculate the Minnesota tax withholding. It's the employer's responsibility to have the employee complete and submit a new form Minnesota W-4. And if they don't give you a valid form and you have an earlier valid form, that is what you continue to use. If you don't have a valid form, then you withhold as if the employee is single and claims 0 withholdings. And if an employee is a non-resident alien of the United States and the employee are subject to income tax withholding, you use Table 1 and procedure under the Minnesota adjustment for non-resident alien employees in IRS publication 15T to determine the correct Minnesota withholding tax. Do not use this procedure for non-resident alien students from India and business apprentices from India. Also, don't use this procedure for certain non-resident aliens who are residents of South Korea. And you'll see IRS Notice 1392 for special instructions on withholding exemptions. And I am not going over either one of those in this video. So again, if you guys have any questions about anything that I went over in this video, please leave a comment below. Feel free to reach out to my firm using one of the contact us options in the video description below. Thank you for watching.